So to kick off the evening and get us thinking about the role of trustees and charities in the current climate, I'd like to welcome to the stage our keynote speaker, who has been described as one of the country's top environmental campaigners. He is Chief Executive of the Wildlife Trusts, which have more than 870,000 members and 35,000 volunteers, and excellent wildlife trusts in Greater Manchester and Lancashire. Our keynote speaker was also the Chief Executive of Friends of the Earth, where he led numerous campaign victories, including on bees and fracking. With a long-established career making our world a better place, it's an honour to welcome Mr. Craig Bennett to address you this evening.
Clap along if you feel like a room without a roof. Clap along if you feel.
Well, thank you, Saeed. Thank you very much. And thank you to the Clothworkers Company, to New Philanthropy Capital, to Prospectus, and to Reach Volunteering for inviting me here to speak to you tonight. This is such an important night where, as Saeed was saying, we raise the bar of great governance by celebrating and recognising examples of excellent governance across the charity sector. You know, in my career, and I'm proud to say and privileged to say I've worked in the UK charity sector for a quarter of a century now, believe it or not. It's been interesting to see how my relationship with governance has evolved over that time. I think in a way is true for so many junior staff when they first come into the charity sector. You hear about the board over there. Sometimes, particularly in large charities, it feels a bit distant. Sometimes it feels a bit kind of mysterious. And you hear discussions amongst the staff about whether something will be approved by the board or not. And it's all slightly confusing. And occasionally there's people called trustees that you might meet at the Christmas party or at the summer barbecue or whatever, and you try and work out, so what do they do? Don't fully understand it. But then as I progressed through roles and I got into more senior roles, then I realised how important the board was. But sadly, of course, and I'm sure this is true, often then there's the perception that the board is seen as something to be a bit of a hurdle. How do we get around this? We can't move until we get the approval of the board again. And as you get more senior, it becomes ever more important. But then I found, as I got into even more significant senior roles, and crucially started to get to know all the board properly and sit in on board meetings and build a better understanding of what trustees do, and remembering also the fact that trustees are volunteers, we should never forget that. Actually, I've learned how to work with the board and build a relationship with boards and trustees where they provide that critical friendship and careful consideration to ultimately provide me with the confidence and support to be bold in what we need to do to deliver our charitable purpose. And when things go well, you get that support from your trustees and that challenge, constructive challenge, that enables you to be bold and confident about the changes you want to see in the outside world, and also bold and confident about the changes you need to make within your own organisation to go about that. But it's also the fact that I've been privileged to see it from the other side of the table, as it were. I've been a trustee of several charities, and I've been a chair of a charity as well, a very small charity, actually, that at one point faced very significant financial difficulties as well. And I would strongly encourage all of you to encourage all your staff, where possible, to get experience of being trustees. It is one of the best things, I think, if you work for a charity, to also be a trustee in another charity to help understand the crucial role of trustees and boards. So in my vantage point now as Chief Executive of the Wildlife Trusts, where I've been for the last 4 years, it's a particularly interesting vantage point on this debate because, of course, we're a federation of autonomous, locally run wildlife trusts, 46 wildlife trusts in total across the UK, Ordney and the Isle of Man. That means we have 46 boards. Actually, no, we have 47 boards because we also have the board of the central charity, which means we have 47 chief execs and 47 chairs and 650 trustees. It's quite interesting, isn't it? But my job is to really try and make sure that we work in harmony and not be one, but be more like a murmuration. And of course, that's a very appropriate imagery for us as the Wildlife Trust, how we can work as separate bodies but work together. And my job, a lot of that, is it's often described as herding cats. Of course, the point is you can't herd cats. If you try and force a cat to go in a certain direction, they will go in exactly the opposite direction to what you want. So my job, really, is to consistently work out what are the big, juicy sardines to hold up that they all willingly run towards. And then, to mix the metaphors, we can look like a nice murmuration. So that's what it's about. I should say also, we have, across the Wildlife Trust, you will know us for our nature reserves. We have more nature reserves than McDonald's has got restaurants in the UK. In fact, 1,000 more. And we've actually got more members than Saeed was just saying. We're now at 920,000 members across the UK, which you might be interested to know is about 10 times the number of people that voted for Liz Truss to become Prime Minister. So when I was invited to speak at this tonight, I think the suggestion was that you might be interested to hear a little bit about my experience of charity campaigning. And I think the thinking was, well, that might be quite useful in an election year and a few months ahead of the election. But then, of course, a certain event and a certain announcement happened just over a week ago in the pouring rain that perhaps makes it even more relevant to be talking about campaigning and perhaps political campaigning at this precise moment. Because let's face it, there has long been quite a bit of nervousness in parts of the charity sector, sometimes around campaigning, and specifically political campaigning as well. Sometimes charities kind of run a mile from it because they think this is not something that charities should do. And yet, we also get those kind of attacks at the time from certain spokespeople as well. You take, for example, Brooks Newmark, if you remember, when he was a civil society minister in 2014, and he criticised charities for campaigning and said, no, the charities should stick to our knitting. I'll get to that in a moment. But the point is, it is rather odd for us to be nervous about this. It is rather odd for us to be nervous sometimes about certain elements deciding to criticise the work of charities. It is rather odd sometimes for us to get into a crouch position and think that we need to protect the charity, quote unquote. Because the reason I say that's rather odd is if you think about it, the reason we exist is not to be charities. The reason we exist is to deliver on our purpose. And through that, we just then choose the best corporate vehicle for delivering on that purpose. And because we choose the charitable corporate vehicle, we of course then have a defined charitable purpose. And that's actually what should govern and lead us in everything we do. And so really the question always comes down to this: what is the best, most effective, and actually most cost-efficient way for any charity to deliver on their charitable purpose? And of course, very often that will be practical action or services. Very often it will be education programs and engagement programs. Sometimes it might even be buying up buildings or land and managing them for heritage purposes, for conservation purposes, or cultural venues, or education venues, or social venues. And we will see some fantastic examples of that tonight from the winners and from the shortlist. But sometimes, the best, most effective, most cost-efficient way of charities delivering on their charitable purpose will be campaigning. And we shouldn't be scared of it. The dictionary definition of a campaign is simply a series of activities designed to achieve a social, economic, or political goal. That's absolutely what we need to do if it's one of the most effective ways on delivering on our charitable purpose. And we do get that criticism sometimes. I was talking there, reminding you about the civil society minister back in 2014, who accused charities of getting too political and saying we should stick to our knitting. And some newspapers still echo this sentiment, suggesting that somehow charity campaigning is a new thing. But the irony is they couldn't be more wrong. If you look at the proud history of British charities, deep within our founding periods is often campaigning. If you take in my sector, for example, you take the National Trust, which has had to endure some appalling attacks in parts of the media over the last couple of years. Actually, the National Trust wasn't founded by people who thought it'd be a great place to go for tea and scones, and I love the tea and scones, don't get me wrong, and I'm a proud member of the National Trust. But it was started by some really brilliant, feisty, by the way, women campaigners who could see what was happening to the landscape and they wanted to protect it. So Octavia Hill, and then supported also by Beatrix Potter, decided that they needed to start an organisation to really make sure that there was good campaigning to protect the countryside in Britain. And over the many years, it evolved into what we know as the National Trust now. But when people criticise the National Trust for engaging in campaigning and saying it's not part of somehow the organisation's history, they could not be more wrong. Similarly, over the last year or so, there's been attacks on our very good friends at the RSPB for campaigning as well. And yet the RSPB was started by, yet again, a group of women who decided they wanted to stop the international trade in birds' feathers back in Victorian times. So that's actually how it started. For us as the wildlife trusts, many of our individual trusts started as local naturalist societies, but many of them also started by communities coming together to protect particular wild spaces in that community. So the moment we say that charities shouldn't campaign, actually we are denying one of the proudest bits of the heritage of British charities, and also denying one of the most effective ways of delivering on our charitable purpose. What about the accusation that sometimes charities can be too political, this phrase, or that we shouldn't engage in politics? Well, that's utterly wrong as well, as it happens. You know, if you pick up the dictionary and look for the dictionary definition of politics, the definition you get back is the activities associated with the governance of a country or an area. Now, it's a rather odd thing, isn't it? The suggestion that charities, we shouldn't somehow engage in discussions about the activities associated with the governance of a country or an area. If that directly relates to our charitable purpose, we would be denying ourselves one of the most effective ways of shaping how the country delivers on our charitable purpose. Now, what we can't be, of course, is party political. We're not allowed to be party political as charities under charity regulations. But all too often, in the debate around this, we don't make the distinction between being political, which is actually perfectly fine, and being party political, which would imply that we're suggesting that people support or not support a particular political party, which, of course, I don't think any of us think charities should do. I would go further and say, actually, it is our duty as charities to draw on our unique expertise, our knowledge, and our experience from working with beneficiaries, from the front line, from seeing what works and what doesn't work. It is our duty to draw on that and tell the truth to society about what we think works and what doesn't work. That's not being party political. That's just using our experience and our knowledge to share and support the debate in society. And so if we really want to push this, I would say that that does mean that sometimes when charities hold back and decide not to engage in that debate, in my experience, it's nearly always because there will be a fear that they might be perceived as offending a particular part of the political spectrum or particular interest groups. Ironically, in my experience, it is the example of charities holding back and deciding not to do something that absolutely represents the clearest examples of being party political rather than going out there, telling the truth about the situation, boldly and confidently, and doing that in a political but non-party political way. Now, the good news about all this is the debate is, at least from a regulatory point of view, in a much better place than it was a few years back. Of course, we've had CC9, Charity Commission Guidance Note 9, for almost 20 years now. But what I'm pleased about is how the chair of the Charity Commission recently has really been championing CC9 and reminding us all about how it supports charity campaigning. To remind you, CC9 says campaigning, advocacy and political activity are all legitimate and valuable activities for charities to undertake. As long, Orlando Fraser tells us, as the political aspect doesn't become the reason for the charity's existence, the sole reason. Of course, we would all agree with that, I'm sure. And more recently, Orlando Fraser has also said that campaigning can be a vital way for charities to advance their cause. So I really welcome that language from the chair of the Charity Commission over this last year. What does all this mean in the context of a general election? Again, sometimes in the charity sector, we think, and I've heard the phrase before now, during a general election, we have to hold back. This is a moment for us to stay quiet. But I think that's rather odd when you think about it. A general election campaign is the precise moment that there's perhaps a more active debate in our society than at any other time about the policies needed to achieve social change and to improve the status of certain sections of society. I would say this is precisely the wrong time for charities to go quiet. It's exactly the right time for us to speak up and draw on our evidence and our experience and our knowledge about what works and what doesn't work in relation to our charitable purpose, and to share that with the national debate about that. Now, of course, there are complexities, regulatory complexities. There is the so-called Lobbying Act, as it's called. And there are lots of things I would say are wrong with the Lobbying Act, and I hope a future government might look at changing it. Not least things like saying that the regulated period lasts for a whole year before a general election. But we never know when a general election is going to be, since they've now scrapped the Fixed Term Parliaments Act. And of course, there's a huge amount of bureaucracy involved around the Lobbying Act as well. It is ultimately just badly drafted, badly written legislation. But often there's been a narrative that somehow this should mean that charities hold back again from campaigning during an election period. But it doesn't mean that at all. Actually, if we are not being party political, which we shouldn't be at any point anyway, then there's not really much to fear about the Lobbying Act. I mean, I want to stress, it's important to get your head around it, and you need to know where the tripwires are, if you like. But as long as we're not trying to influence how people vote for a particular party or not party, as long as we're just engaging the debate around policy and the changes that are needed in support of our charitable purpose, then there's no reason why charities should feel chilled by it. We at the Wildlife Trust are planning a huge amount of work over the next 5 to 6 weeks. We've been planning it for over a year now, and Wildlife Trusts across the UK will be organising local hustings for prospective parliamentary candidates to try and really push the sentiment that the British public cares deeply about nature and climate, to push it up the agenda. Now, there is a point about tone in all of this, and last autumn you had the chair of the Electoral Commission and the chair of the Charity Commission come together and do a joint blog in which they called on charities, they encouraged charities to get involved in the general election when it came, but to encourage us to do so in a manner that's respectful and tolerant, and in a tone that reflects our standing as charities. Well, I'm absolutely happy to endorse that. I think that's absolutely right. I think that's what we should do. But I think if that's what's expected of charities, then I think we as society also have a right and an entitlement to expect that from our political parties. We also have a right and expectation to expect that from those wanting to be our elected representatives. And in my experience, we're not necessarily seeing our elected representatives or our political parties currently engaging in a debate that is respectful and tolerant in tone, as is expected of charities. Why expect one thing of charities but not expect it of political parties and political candidates? And I would like our politicians, all of them, to be a bit more respectful in tone about how they talk about charities. Because, you know, I reckon the UK charity sector is one of the jewels in the crown of the UK. It's one of the things we can be most proud about. It really is out there. If you look at it internationally, the UK charity sector punches way above its weight and is hugely impactful here in the UK and right around the world. We never talk about it in the way we should. We talk about how proud we can be of our creative industries, sometimes our universities, sometimes our accountancy firms, but we don't talk enough about how proud we should be of the UK charity sector, which, to my mind, is one of the best charity sectors anywhere in the world. So we, in this sector, should be proud. We should be bold and confident. We should also be bold and confident and not chilled when some politicians accuse us of engaging in gesture politics. Because I don't think we do, on the whole. I see many more politicians and many more newspapers engaging in gesture politics than I do the vast majority of charities. So I think right now is a moment for us to feel really confident about the UK charity sector, for us to make sure we never find ourselves in a crouched position, and instead that we walk proudly about the role that we play in trying to deliver a better world and a better UK. And for that reason, it's wonderful that we've come together tonight to celebrate the very best of good governance across the UK charity sector. My huge congratulations to all those that have been shortlisted tonight, and of course, huge congratulations for the winners that we're about to find about shortly. Thank you very much.